Official countdown. Okay. I'm Luke Warosco.
I'm Max Tierney.
And I'm Charles Whalen.
And that's Joe Murray. And we are interviewing Mr. Joseph Tierney here on December 8th, 2019. All right, to start out, what would be, why don't you describe your first childhood memory?
The first memory I have from childhood would be of living in Waukegan, Illinois. My father at that point was, I think, still in the FBI, and it was either at the very end of the Second World War or immediately after the Second World War. And we lived in a bungalow, the address of which I do not know, and it featured a wonderful gas station. Now, you guys have no idea what gas stations were like when I was a kid. They actually repaired cars, so they had tools and grease and gunk and stuff, and it was very cool. And I was forbidden to go there. And nonetheless, my friend Freddie Morrison and I did that on a fairly regular basis and got gunked up thoroughly. And I guess I was duly disciplined. But that period is the earliest of my recollections. My bet is that I was 4, maybe 5 in those times. And unlike today, you could let your kids walk out the door and they could go do stuff. So that's it. It was a joy. It was a happy period.
So you mentioned your father as working for the FBI.
Yes.
What was his position in the FBI?
He was an agent of the FBI from the beginning of the Second War throughout it. He had graduated from law school at that time, which was a requirement for service in the FBI. He had to be a lawyer or an accountant. And he developed himself into a weapons expert and used to run around giving demonstrations of firing of weapons to police departments, among other people. And he was stationed in numerous places, including New York City and Grand Rapids, Michigan, but we ended up in Waukegan because he was assigned to the general area of the Great Lakes Naval Base, which was a big training center in the Second World War. And he spent his career in the FBI, came out of that career, studied to become a certified public accountant, passed the examination and began to practice as a certified public accountant. At that point, he moved back to Milwaukee. He and my mom, Bernice Tierney, moved back to Milwaukee.
So maybe describe a little bit about your family life, your parents, your brothers and your sisters.
Yeah, I am the oldest of 4. I'm born in 1942. My oldest sister, Catherine, was born in 46. My middle sister, Mary Alice, was born in 1950. And the youngest of our siblings, Margaret Mary, was born in 56, if my recollection is right. We lived initially in Milwaukee at 6425 West Wells Street. That was directly across from Jacobus Park, from what would be the south entrance to Jacobus Park. It's a great place to grow up as a kid because you walked right across the street, and it was a park of several hundred acres. It was an enormous park, if any of you know it. And it was fun to play in. We had a good group of guys, and we hung out and did what we wanted to do for many years.
So speaking of Jacobus Park and doing things as a kid, were there any other things, special hobbies, places to go, anything you remember?
In particular, I did a lot of ice skating when I was a kid. Jacobus Park had a pond, and it still has that pond, but in those times it was maintained for ice skating. So they have a wonderful pavilion, and you carried your skates into the pavilion. You could change your skates, leave your shoes there, and out you would go. And during the winter months, I skated after I got home from school, and then down after dinner till 8:30, 9 o'clock. I think of those days and wonder when I got homework done. But that's not a subject that I worry a great deal about at this stage of my life.
All right, so you mentioned your sisters. Did you and your friend just there, what was your kind of relationship with your sisters? Would you guys do stuff together?
Guys, I was a guy, the oldest of 3 sisters. My relationship was intentionally distant, the very best kind. They had their own lives, and we all went to St. Jude's. Well, I went to the Jefferson Kindergarten, and then on to St. Jude's School for the grades. And my sisters went behind me. In fact, I believe all of them went through the grades at St. Jude's, which we lived at 6425 for all of the years I was in grade school. We moved to 662 North 78th Street, which is much closer to St. Jude's, when I started Marquette High.
So a little bit about St. Jude's. Kind of just describe your experience there, kind of activities you're involved in, any special memories?
Oh, our classes were enormous. There were 60 kids in my first grade class. I want you to feature that. In the classes you went to, that would be a minimum of 2 classes and maybe 3. The school was conducted by the Agnesians, an order out of Fond du Lac, and it's hard to think of it in these terms, but these were young girls. They were in their 20s, and they were teaching 60 kids, and they did magnificent work. To illustrate, I had tonsillitis and that sort of problem, and in the 2nd grade, I had them out, and it saved my hearing. The significance of that is that the 2nd grade teacher was sharp enough to notice that I wasn't really hearing her instructions. Well, I was one of a herd. I mean, there were a lot of guys and gals in that class. And she was pretty sharp enough to pick that up and to go at my parents and say, I think you got a problem. And the problem was correct. She correctly recognized the problem, and I was in a position, my parents were in a position to have me go in and have my tonsils removed. And it was a pretty good experience. We had because the classes were big, we had a decent grade school football team, by the way. It was a quality football team because we had about 60, 70 boys to draw from over the three, 6th, 7th, and 8th grades. And we were probably the best grade school football team in the parochial league in which we played in those years. And a lot of those guys went on to play for Marquette High and did very well. I had a lot of good friends that continue to be, in effect, lifelong friends from grade school. I think of Dennis McNally, who practiced law in this town for many years, died, I believe, last year. He and I actually went to Jefferson Grade School together, St. Jude's, Marquette High, Marquette University, and then the law school. We were in slightly different years in the law school because of he was in the engineering school, and his experience in the engineering school involved an internship that delayed graduation. But there were a number of people like that, and those friendships persisted through grade school. But when we got to Marquette High, I had a new group of friends and a new, very different life than my life as a grade school kid. As you guys know, that's part of your experience.
Yeah, so you mentioned you have a lot of friends. What were kind of the things you did for fun, the activities, even sports at Jude's?
Football, we played a lot of baseball. Basically, sports were not organized the way they are now, so the baseball was pickup. We played scrubs for hours. And the grade school football was important, and as we got on, basketball was important, but it was pretty much less grade school teams and club teams the way you see it now. The AAU notion, for example, there was nothing even remotely like that. So our experience as even in high school was limited to the Catholic League and maybe one or two games outside of it. No state championship tournament the way you guys have it now.
Transitioning kind of a little bit now into high school, as you were mentioning. So you obviously went to Marquette High. What was your experience like there?
It was a great experience. One of the things I went into and benefited mightily from was debate and forensics. I debated all 4 years, did forensics all 4 years. We were a very successful team, and it was a blast. It's different. Those encounters then are very different than they were, than they have been over the last few years. Than for example, the experiences of my son as a high school debater was quite different than mine, and then my grandson's experience is different even than his. But debate and forensics were very useful to me, and those guys formed the principal friendships I had, and they persisted into law school. And a good example is my debate partner was Michael Stapleton. He was a year behind me in. He's a '61 grad of Marquette High, I believe, but he ended up he went to Marquette undergrad and went to Yale Law School. Did very well there. We were a decent debate team, and we actually in turn went on and debated at Marquette U when Marquette U had a debate team, which is not so now. But debate and forensics were pretty much the center of my my high school experience, and formed the essence of my social life too, because we dated the girls from DS and Holy Angels, and coming out of those programs because they're the ones we knew. So, and that was very good. It was a lot of fun.
So you mentioned your debate experience was different than your sons and your grandsons. What was the debate experience like? How did it differ?
In several important respects. When I was debating, teams were four-man teams. Two guys would be have responsibility for the affirmative of the proposition. Two guys would have responsible for the negative of the proposition. They would debate as a team, and their combined record would be the record of the team. Now, by the time my son, both my sons, Martin, Joe, and Martin, went to Marquette High, debate was two-man. A two-man debate team would be responsible for both affirmative and negative, and they would debate affirmative in one round, negative in the next, affirmative, negative, for preliminary rounds, and then would go into elimination rounds. And that was very different. Also, the techniques were different. When I debated, the debate was a little more rhetorical, and the process of debating was slower. We would talk faster than I am talking now, but nowhere near as fast as debate was conducted by the time my son Joe and my son Martin debated for Marquette High, and that same speed was true of the experience that my grandson Joe and Max, you experienced. Their experiences is that debate is conducted at a far faster level, and that's both good and bad. More material is covered, but I think it's covered less rigorously and carefully, and it becomes much harder to judge. Judging is much more technical. In the time when I debated, the question was better debating as judged, rather than did you win this point and that point, and the judgments that went into determining who won a debate were quite different.
All right, so obviously debate and debate and forensics, but especially debate, could connect to kind of your being a lawyer. Was that?
Oh yeah, no question about it. It was important to my development for a number of reasons. The first and most important is it taught me to be able to stand up in any setting and talk to anybody, and enabled me to address groups with my worries being only those related to contents, not presentation. It also developed the skills to quickly organize material in ways to present. Those are skills that I use even today with my clients. That's why I encourage my sons and my grandsons to spend at least some time doing debate and forensics, because the skills that develop are coming into play even as I answer your questions. So yes, those skills extremely translatable into the things that lawyers do, not only in pleading cases and making arguments, but in making presentations to clients and others, and also helping to enable you to organize your thoughts and do it often on the run. One of the form of forensics I was most interested in was extemp, which was extempore speaking. You were given a topic on a national subject, and you were given a half hour to prepare a 10-minute talk, and you were permitted to use a note card, and you talked extemporaneously off of the note card. Well, the effect of that was it taught me to read swiftly and substantively, and it got me to think a lot about the background, the general background in which I was working. And in extemp, the topics were extremely broad. They were political, economic, and social on a global basis. In the finals of state, there were 6 guys, and my topic was Indira Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and whether or not he was making good judgments with respect to the relationship between India and China. Well, I had to have some background to know what that was about, and so my reading was tested, and then I had a half hour to prepare that talk. So it's great training, and if I can sell any of you guys on doing it, please consider it. It's very much worth the work.
So you obviously you're competing against different high schools.
Yes.
Do you specifically remember not only some of the high schools you're competing, but were there any like rivalries or?
Oh, sure. Racine St. Catherine had a very strong debate team. Paul Wyrick and Wayne Landre were 2 of the guys. Paul Wyrick was a force in conservative politics over the ensuing 20 or 25 years. He and I had been very close in those times. Peter Peschick was out of, oh goodness, one of the upstate schools, was not Spash, but in that area. And he turned out to be an assistant attorney general with the state of Wisconsin. Who else? The guys I debated with, of course, Mike Stapleton and Don Quinlan, who ended up as a professor of psychology at Yale. He was my partner through the first 3 years of high school. I mean, these were capable people, and they had good programs. The rivalries changed over time, of course, so that the Brookfields became very strong. Spash is now a serious competitor. But in my time was Racine St. Catherine's. DSHA had decently capable girls. Pius had Dennis Wicht and Bob Wyson. These guys and gals were capable, and they were fun to deal with, and they formed part of the social groups that I had when I went on to college and beyond.
All right. So you mentioned social groups and friends, especially now during high school. What kind of, not only what did you do, but kind of were there certain hangout spaces or certain parts of the city?
For us, we had there was a pizza place in the near south side called Giovanni's. I'm not sure it even exists anymore. I was run by a little Italian gray-haired woman, and we went out there, and we used to hang out there for hours. I'm not sure she really made any material amount of money on our trade, but we were certainly there often, and we ate a lot of pizza there. I'm not sure we were fabulous tippers, but she seemed to like our company, and we hung out at Gillis's. Doesn't everybody? Gillis's was created in the 30s. I mean, so it's been around a long time, and it was a central meeting point for pious people and Marquette High people, and I bet that's still true. But in my times, it was run by a guy who had Norris on his bib, okay? And so everybody called him Norris. Well, Norris was the company who washed and supplied the coveralls. His name was not Norris. Actually, I've forgotten what his name is. He ended up, as I understand it, buying the place, but I could be wrong about that. But that's what we did, and we went and watched the football games and did the stuff that you guys do. A lot of dances and mixers and stuff like that. I mean, I'm not adding any description to that you guys won't have experienced.
So you went to Marquette High, and then you went to Marquette U for undergrad. So what made you choose Marquette University?
It was a good alternative for us. I was able to live at home, something which is not typical for these days, but a lot of the people I went through high school with went to Marquette, first because there were Marquette High guys and DS gals and pious guys and gals. And it was easy and cheap to live at home. And Marquette was a good school, and it was close. And for me, it was particularly useful because I could go down with my father in the car. He'd drop me off in the morning, and I could go back with him at night and spend a day at school. And then, of course, the really serious advantage was that I had access to a vehicle. Now, a guy or gal who lives at home or in Milwaukee in college with access to a vehicle has serious social standing. I don't want you guys to labor under any doubts in that regard. It's important. So it was good. And I went into the business school, and I was there for 3 years. I was on a program in which I was 3 years in the undergraduate school, and my last year of undergraduate school was taken up by my first year of law school. And I ended up with what was called a general business degree, but I had taken a lot of accounting in particular, which is something I urge that people who go into law school consider doing. It's just a useful area of study. So Marquette was great, and I did debate at the college level, and there we did a lot of traveling. There the debate was also two-man in the format that I described earlier as what had happened at high school. By college, in the college debate format, it was two-man, and Stapleton and I were doing debate on a two-man basis, and we were decent.
So you continued debate throughout college?
Yes, actually. Actually, I debated because I was still an undergraduate while I was in law school. That was my last year of college debate. And it was terrific. It was a lot of fun. And I learned a ton. I guess overall, I debated for 8 years.
All right, so you mentioned having a car was an advantage for you.
Yes.
Because you're living at home. But did you feel, or were there other advantages or even disadvantages for living at home and not living on the campus?
Social integration was a little more difficult, I think. In undergraduate school, my friends in undergraduate school were largely DSHA girls and Pius guys and some Marquette High guys. And it was a little more difficult to integrate with guys who were resident in the dorms or in the fraternity houses and that sort of thing. So that was the disadvantage. You were a little insular, but dating was a lot easier because you didn't have to walk and you didn't have to use cabs. You'd drive around, and it was nice. So positives and negatives. I think ultimately, I did the same in law school. That is to say, I ended up living at home in law school. And that helped me a lot because I had a regular format for the day. And I was willing to take 8 a.m. classes because I was down there by then and could use my time pretty well and then go home towards the end of the evening. Now, when I got to law school, for those of you who will do that, you'll learn going home is not what happens at night in law school. You labor in your particular vineyards. So I would get home much later, but lived on the number 10 bus line, so even when the driving wasn't available, the bus was.
All right, we're just going to take a quick break because this background has been shaking.
I should add, I think, with respect to living at home, my parents were pretty accommodating, and their guidance was endlessly useful. My father was a lawyer and an accountant, and had a lot of experiences that were pertinent to where I was going, and he communicated those things pretty easily, and they conducted our household affairs so that things were pretty convenient for me to do the studying I had to do and live the life I had to lead. They were joy. So, enough on that.
So you mentioned law school.
Yeah.
So when you chose law school, you have been debating. Your father was a lawyer, to my understanding. So what were kind of the components, the decisions, the reasons why you wanted to pursue law?
Oh, I never considered anything else. My grandfather had been a lawyer. My father was a lawyer. And I knew that the things that I was good at were kind of appropriate to that profession, and so I really never thought about anything else. As for choosing Marquette, actually, the 3-3 program kind of forced it a bit. I had to start at Marquette, and I wanted to continue to debate at Marquette, so staying at Marquette and going to law school at Marquette was important. So I stayed there, and that worked out very well for me. My law school education was excellent, and pieces of it stick with me even now as I go forward in the profession. So I was happy at the law school. Understand, law school classes were much smaller than I started with 80 kids in law school. Our freshman class had 80 in it. By the time of graduation, we were down to something like 55. And I think there were 55 graduates out of the 80. We had lost the others. They had dropped out and moved on to other things. And I had a very good law class. The law class behind me was excellent. Good people, and Marquette was a good place to learn the law. And after Marquette, I had the opportunity to spend an additional year in law school, this time at New York University, to pick up a master's degree in the law of taxation. And I did that, took that opportunity, and that was pretty much the foundation of my career. So I guess if you do a count, I spent more years in law schools than I did in undergraduate, 4 and 3, which is exactly the reverse of the norm. So law school was, I found that as you progressed from grade school to high school, from high school to college, and from college to law school, each was more fun than the last. I think you guys will find that too. For me, it was definitely true. And my intellectual development, the foundations were created in high school, no question about that. But undergraduate school was very good in that regard, and law school was great. So
you said as you progress in school, you had more and more fun. Describe a little bit what was the difference in environments in undergrad compared to law school.
In undergraduate school, you'd take maybe 16 or 17 hours of credit hours. In law school, it was 15, so you had a little more time. But the subjects in law school were just profoundly interesting. If you're going to be a good lawyer, you're going to have to care about how things work, what actually happens when people do things, how the courts work, how elections work, how contracts work, how the law disposes of circumstances in which people injure one another. And for me, those explanations made sense, and I could make the distinctions that were important to understanding them pretty easily. Again, primarily because of the education that I had previously had, and frankly, the training that I got being in my house, being in the home of my father and mother. So law school is a lot more independent study, and a lot more time is spent organizing your thoughts on subjects. The subjects are more difficult, and you're required to actually command a larger body of understanding of subject, but you can organize it, and because you can see clearly how the pieces hang together, in some respects, I found it not terribly much harder, and it was interesting. It's engaging.
So you, just backtracking a little bit, you mentioned the 3Ms program. Was that a reason to?
It wasn't so much a program as you mean Marquette High, Marquette U, and Marquette Law. It was just a series of choices, and I made them, and it worked out well because I could live at home and save the expense of dorm living or independent living, and the other aspect of it is that when you grow up in a town like Milwaukee and you're educated in its educational institutions, you have a lot of knowledge that you can't even articulate. You know people and places. You have an idea of what's one of my friends used to refer to as the Who Shot John in town. And that knowledge is enhanced by paying attention to your surroundings and by having gone through school in this environment. So doing those things wasn't so much a program, it was more a set of choices and events.
So you said the Fushan Jar or whatever. So that was obviously a place in Milwaukee, and you've lived in this city for most of your life.
Yeah.
You mentioned some places you went and kind of hung out in high school. Did those changes, or did those places change much during law school, Marquette U, or was there?
Oh, sure. I mean, some of those institutions came and went. The Eagles Club, for example, used to be a place where the Eagle Club members met. Then it became a place where dances were held. Then it became the rave. I mean, these are pretty significant changes in the institutional character of a location. Sure, those things changed. My wife and I were driving actually a little earlier today and noted a significant amount of changes just on Blue Mound Road as we drove it. But the thing about it is, you can't appreciate those changes if you don't remember what they were beforehand. And the center of Wauwatosa, what's called the Village, I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, dramatically different than it was as little as 10 years ago. That's been by virtue of a very significant effort on the part of the mayors and town council, city councils that have governed Wauwatosa of recent days, but also in the real estate investments that were made and the changes and the new businesses that are there and the old businesses that have left. When you live in a town for a long time, you become integrated into its mechanics, and you do things and see things.
So you talked kind of some of the changes in the Eagles Club and stuff like that. Were there just kind of general big picture stuff that was maybe different than it is tonight, whether it's in the Village or in Tosa where you lived or even downtown?
There's a sense in which everything is different.
Yeah.
Marquette U was a very good example. Its physical, its buildings are much better than they were. Marquette High is very different. I was taught by a lot of Jesuit scholastics, some of whom went on to be really serious and capable people. Father Bill Neenan had been trained in economics, and he was here, and he helped run the debate program. You guys are taught primarily by lay people. There are far fewer Jesuits involved in your training. On the other hand, many of the lay people who taught at Marquette High in recent times are products of Jesuit education and are deeply integrated into the thinking behind Jesuit education, and that creates continuity, so that your education is very different than mine. I mean, we're talking 60 years. It's very different than mine in many substantive respects, but not so different in many others. But certainly your physical plant is different. That was an automobile dealership, Glenn Humphrey's Chevrolet, if my recollection served me. Well, Glenn Humphrey was a Mason, but he was a friend of my dad's, and they were together for many years, and ultimately, as I recall it, Glenn Humphrey donated that piece of property to the high school. But it was when I would pass it every day. It was an automobile dealership.
So you mentioned the Tosa Village. None of this. Describe a little bit, if you recall. I should preface by saying that. But what were some of those changes from kind of what today, but even not so much recently, but kind of where, even going back to your childhood or college or.
Well, okay. Let's talk about Tosa Village in my childhood. The number 10 streetcar line is now the number 10 bus line. Runs from roughly Wells and Wisconsin Avenue through down in may touch Blue Mound Road from time to time, but it's the central artery of the Milwaukee County transit system. Okay. When I was a kid, that was a streetcar, and it moved over a viaduct over the Miller Valley, and its terminus was in the village. And it's not a streetcar like the snazzy streetcars, none of that. No, it was a real streetcar. Ran on tracks, had an electric. It ran on electric power that was in the what do you call it? It's overhead. Guys, I need to stop for a minute to blow my nose. Talking about the village, and I was saying the number 10 streetcar line ran down 68th Street and then turned and went to the village, and it ended on the west side of the river, okay, and the streetcars don't turn around. Rather, you pick up the gear that operates them, that from what was the front, and you march it to what was the back, put them down, and now it's the back, it's the front, and where it was the back, and then it goes in the reverse. That was important transit in its time, and when the streetcars were taken down, that transit was lost. Village had economic issues for some time and slowly began to come back. I had a very close friend named Pete Brusky, who I had known from Racine St. Catherine's and their debate program, who was a lawyer, a solo practitioner, and he had an office in the second story of what's called the Quick Flash building, which now houses one of the two hamburger restaurants. I've forgotten the name of it, but that are down there. And his practice has moved out to Mayfair, but he had a wonderful office overlooking the river in a beautiful old building. Now, those buildings are, to some extent, still there. But many other buildings are there, and they've been very much rebuilt, and the place restructured to have much more economic vitality. And then, of course, the so-called Friendship Bridge was put in place that, in effect, made it possible to go from one side of the river to the other at the village level. So the village looks dramatically different from what it did when I was a kid, yet a lot of those buildings are very much the same buildings. They've just been changed in function and operation. And so, for example, the YMCA was right next to the Women's Club, Wauwatosa Women's Club, and right across the street from Wauwatosa East High School. And I spent some time there in the days of my youth, at YMCA, during the summer. So there's a continuity to all of this, and things change. In some respects, you'd say slowly, but also rapidly. But Milwaukee has had that type of continuity, and it's had continuity in its social problems too. It's fair to say Milwaukee is probably one of the most segregated cities in the country. That was true when I was a kid, and it's still true now. I think the pressure that is on the city resulting from that was less then, because there were a number of businesses and industries which operated on the near north side and no longer operate there. During the period in which manufacturing was downsized, a lot of those jobs were lost, and it has been difficult for that community to find comparable employment. It's been impossible. So for good and ill, things have changed, but many things have remained pretty much as they were. This city has had, for example, coherent ethnic groups, which you don't see in many other cities. That is to say, my context for it is soccer. The Croatians have 2 clubs. Those clubs are based on churches, Orthodox churches. And Croatians, I'm sorry, I meant Serbs. They are associated with Orthodox churches, and those teams were peopled by, when I was a kid and when my sons were kids, peopled by Serbs, and they spoke Serbian on the field. So also Croatians, the Croatian team. Actually, my son played a little bit for Croatian Eagles, and he often was the only guy who didn't speak Croatian on the field. That was true of the Italians, and there were several German teams, Bavarians, and the sport club out on the far northwest side, where there were fairly coherent groups speaking the language that they had brought from the old country. And I don't think you saw that as much in other cities. That's less so than it was, certainly when I was a kid. But it's still of some importance. we're off subject a little bit.
No, that's fine. That was interesting. But just to backtrack just a little bit, because we'll get to that shortly. You said there's obviously differences with Marquette High specifically.
Yeah.
And we talked a little bit more about the educational stuff, but there are any kind of structural differences? Were there any special?
Yeah, there was. When I went to Marquette High, we were streamed. Okay, took an entrance exam, and in those times, there were far fewer places than there were kids testing for them, and they would take 250 or so. I think your classes are not much larger than that, maybe a little larger, but 250 kids, and then they broke them down by performance on that test. So the top guys were in F1. The next guys were in F2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There were 7 groups in each freshman class. And if you progressed academically, you moved from F5 to F2, which is what I did after my first semester. And then and there was movement throughout the freshman, sophomore, and junior years, so that there was an S1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in the senior year. That's a process called streaming. I think modern educational theory would suggest that was not a good process. I'm not sure I know what I think about that. It seemed to go pretty well for me. Some people liked it, some people didn't, but structurally, neither my son's experiences nor my grandson's experiences are anything like that. I think you're still streamed a bit in the sense of moving on to honors classes and that sort of thing, but I think it's more based on the performances that you have made in any particular class, indicating that you might have skills that are pertinent to the next class moving up.
Right,
but that structurally is the most critical element. We didn't have a lot of the audiovisual that you guys did. I mean, guys sat in classrooms with notepads. They wrote on them. You typed on actual, by God, typewriters, your papers. So it's different, but if you ask me what the fundamental structural difference was, I would say that's it.
All right, sounds good. So now we're jumping forward in
Yeah.
again. But you were obviously, so you went to Marquette U, then you went to law school there, then you went to NYU, and then shortly after that, to my understanding, you were drafted.
Correct.
As part of the Vietnam War. So we should start where we're beginning. So how did you find out that you were drafted?
Got a letter. And was not unanticipated. That was expected to be so. And it was, and I was drafted and went to basic combat training in Fort Campbell, Kentucky. It was an experience. But by then I was a lawyer, and the Judge Advocates General Corps at that time needed lawyers pretty badly. So I signed up to be in the Judge Advocates General Corps and was made an officer. When I joined the JAG, and to do that, I committed to a 4-year term. In fact, it was not that long. I was out after 3 years and maybe 9 months. But so I was drafted in during the Vietnam War, but I did not have combat experience.
So you said you were a lawyer at that point.
Mhm.
But when you first got that letter, I mean, what was the kind of the emotions, kind of the gut reaction? Did you have any idea that you would avoid the combat and being a lawyer kind of move into that section, or was there?
No, I knew it was coming because that was before the draft lottery, and then you just got called up when you reached the relevant age, and I had several deferments for education, which I took, and then so I knew that they had a window to draft me, and I expected that they would, and they did. And I don't remember being emotional about it in the sense of being, I knew it was going to change my life dramatically, and indeed it did. And I expected it was possible that I would have combat experience, but unlikely, if only because of my educational background. And so, and it proved to be, for me, a very worthwhile experience.
So what, kind of just to expand a little bit, explain kind of what you actually did as part of the military.
Okay, I was drafted, and then I went through basic combat training. During that period, I applied for admission to the Judge Advocate General's Corps. I was accepted. I was made an officer, and I was promptly assigned to Fort Monroe, Virginia, as part of the Judge Advocate General's staff of what was the Continental Army Command. It's important to remember, at that point, the Army was training thousands of guys to go into combat. And the Continental Army Command, in effect, was a very large training command. So it had two functions. It conducted through the various forts and posts throughout the United States the training. For example, I was trained at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. That Fort Campbell was a military post answering to one of the 5 so-called CONUS armies, Continental United States armies, and they're answerable to Fort Monroe, which was interposed Continental Army Command between the separate Continental armies and the posts. And as I said, it was a training command. It was designed to structure training and also the second function was to conduct those posts. So for example, Fort Bragg in North Carolina was housed the 82nd Airborne Division. Well, the people at Fort Bragg had to actually conduct the operations of what amounts to a city. A military post is a fair-sized city. You've got to feed, house, clothe, provide medical care to all the people who are there, and then you got to train them to jump out of airplanes. And so that was run out of the Continental Army Command. The JAG Corps, in effect, handled legal problems that arose in that process. But it also assisted post-JAG. There was a JAG office that for each post in the Army that handled military discipline and trials and that sort of thing for the post itself. So I did some of that work. And then I did that for about 2 years and was brought up to the Pentagon and spent the last 2 years in the legal assistance office in the Pentagon, where I offered legal assistance to a lot of general officers and ran the Army's tax program. Army has a lot of people in uniform, but they all have federal income tax obligations. What's more, the Internal Revenue Code has a number of provisions that relate to how tax laws apply to soldiers. And I got to be fairly expert in those provisions and helped run tax training programs for JAG officers to help people in various locations throughout actually the world get people to fill out their tax returns and send them into the Internal Revenue Service.
So you described a few different locations. Is there any like specific favorite kind of funny memory that you have of being at one of those bases?
Yes, some of them I can't talk about though, because they involve attorney-client matters, but put that aside. The Pentagon was a lot of fun. There were a lot of really highly capable people who were a joy. They were just fun to be around, and they worked really hard, and they played pretty hard, and we had a good time. You worked hard during the day and sometimes at night, but on the weekends, I can remember weekends playing golf, going to the track at night, and betting on dogs and ponies dragging sulkies. I was not terribly successful bettor, but I learned to read a form sheet. That's a skill that has not translated to anything useful to me, but it was a joy. It was useful, and the work was good work.
So after your kind of military experience was done, you came back to Milwaukee.
Yes.
What was kind of the vibe around Milwaukee, coming that you were in D.C. and you were in New York? So kind of what was the reaction, Milwaukee's kind of vibe around the whole Vietnam War?
The colleges were in ferment in the Vietnam War era. That said, because I graduated from undergraduate school in '64, I was a little ahead of the curve on that. So it was in the '70s that in the late '60s and early '70s that the riots and the blowing up the chemistry lab in Madison and all that occurred after I had been out of college. In social settings when I was in New York at NYU, I began to be exposed to a lot of virulent anti-war judgment and protests and that sort of thing. In amongst the people in the Army that I met, and those guys were generally officers, and they were late company grade officers or young field grade officers. Not so much. They didn't feel strongly about it. They went about their duty and did their business. And I would see these guys cycling back from Vietnam into a duty station within the United States, and then expecting to be cycled back out, because tours in those times were about a year long, not only for enlisted guys, but for officers too, until you reached a certain level. And a lot of them wanted to go back because it was a way for them to make their careers. A lot of those guys did the fighting, but there were a lot of troops, even troops in Vietnam, who never saw a shot fired. I think that by the time '72 came, and that was when I was coming out, the focus was much more on Nixon's misbehavior than his termination of the Vietnam War. Now, his termination of the Vietnam War had not gone well. The United States had kind of abandoned the South Vietnamese government and had failed to supply them as it should have, and they were overwhelmed by the North Vietnamese army, which was a capable army. And there was a lot of complaint about that. But by then, Nixon's misbehaviors were, how shall I say, of greater interest to people generally than the Vietnam War, which had kind of lost its steam as a political issue. But again, it's important to understand that this is how I was seeing it from the perspective of my experience and the perspective of the people with whom I was engaged.
So when you came back in '72, did you kind of re-encounter or even keep in contact with different people, but different friends that maybe weren't, that didn't maybe avoid the combat or were drafted and kind of went a different route than you did?
Sure, and without, I didn't know many who had avoided the draft by going to Canada, for example. I didn't know of anybody who had done that. Some guys had been in the Army, some guys hadn't been drafted, some guys were 4F'd out. But to me, at least, didn't matter much. It was what you're doing now. What are you going to do? How are you going to build your life? And of course, in 1972, I was coming out of the Army, and Kay and I had a quality mattress and a blue Ford, and that was it. And we rented a place and and I had a good job. I started doing that job, and for me, the most important legislation was the Tax Reform Act of 1969, and indeed, some of its provisions are still in the front of my mind because of issues that I've got before me. All these people who I had known were coming now out of their experiences, and some of them were war experiences, but most weren't, and now framing the rest of their lives and looking for to build careers and to do things and to pursue their interests.
So how did you specifically kind of now form your life after the military?
Began a little earlier than that. When I was in the law school, I was looking around for post-law school employment, and my father suggested that Richard Green was one of the best tax lawyers in the city, and I should talk to him about employment, which I did. So I began to work for what was then Shea, Hoyt, and Green in '66, even before I went to NYU. Well, they encouraged me to go to NYU because they were a tax firm, and NYU was going to prepare me for a tax career. And then when I got drafted, they said, okay, when you come back, we'll have a job for you. And I used to do actually some work for them, research, when I got the opportunity during the periods I was in the Army, especially in Washington. And so that when I actually came out of the Army in '72, I had a job. I was ready to go. And I settled right down and started working. From that point on, that's what I've done. I've continued to work actually for the same firm since 1972. And I was associated with them in 1966.
So especially working for the same firm you made most of your life, would there be any kind of hypothetical kind of just anything that you would maybe change about kind of that period in your life where you were making these decisions about your career?
No, don't think so. For me, it's turned out extremely well. I liked very much the people I worked for then. At one point, the firm broke up into two, and I chose what I thought was the right side, and that worked out very well. And it's given me, I got responsibility very early within the firm, and got to work with good clients, and many of those clients I've known and worked with for all these years. So no, I'm not inclined to think that I would change much of anything.
So you mentioned your wife coming back from the war. Were you married not in the war, but were you married when you were in the military?
Yes. I didn't get married in uniform, just so you know. It was a tux and stuff, as you do. But actually, that was one of the motivations for me signing up for the JAG Corps, because I didn't want our married life to begin in a setting in which I'd be exposed to combat and living in that environment. So signing up for and it meant a lot more income too. And so signing up for the JAG Corps facilitated us getting married. And I was married in 1968. In July of 1968 in the cathedral at Duluth, Minnesota, which was her home. And then after our marriage, she drove the blue Ford down to Fort Monroe, Virginia, and we took a duplex right on post in Fort Monroe, and we were there until I was reassigned to the Pentagon, and we took an apartment in Alexandria. And it was kind of hard for her because, when you're in the Army, you know what you're going to do tomorrow. You're going to get up in the morning, you're going to go do your work. And if it's legal work, you know how to do it, and you go do it. For her, it was carving out a whole new life. And actually, she did an interesting thing. She had a journalism background, and she worked for the Newport Daily News, I think is what it was. The newspaper there, and had, she was had a byline articles and did a lot of work for the newspaper, was a reporter. And my first son was born in 1969 at Langley Air Force Base. He spoke with a Virginia accent when he got home.
All right, maybe this is a good time to take a break.
Yeah.
We're getting into the thick of things, so I don't want to stall too long. But yeah, feel free to take a break. We're just going to quick convene just in terms. All right, so we talked a bunch about your career and stuff like that. Is there any other further comments you would like to say about anything?
No, I've been greatly blessed and very fortunate. I've been fortunate in my career in terms of the partners I've had and the clients, by and large, the clients I've had, the things I've been fortunate enough to do. My family in particular and the outcomes of my family have been more than we could ever hope for. Beyond that, not a lot. I owe a great deal to the people who educated me, particularly this institution and the university, and to the church in general. I'm a believing Catholic, I've tried within the confines of my abilities to honor the precepts of the church and operate in the community consistently with what's required of me by the church and its teachings. And I've done the best I can in that regard, and I've been, as I said, greatly blessed.
All right. We are now kind of backtracking in time again.
Yeah.
Just kind of moving on to kind of some of the civil rights stuff. You were obviously you lived on the same street as Judge Cannon.
Yes.
Who was a centerpiece of one of the protests. So that protest specifically, judging that it was so close to you, kind of describe what you saw, what you heard.
Protest movements, especially peaceful ones that are designed to move a society peacefully in appropriate directions, are often the product of strong-minded individuals. That the protest time that you mentioned and that I saw as an observer were largely driven by a diocesan priest named of Grappi. We called him Father Grappi, and I cannot remember his first name. James, I believe. And he was complaining about the treatment of blacks in the community, and largely about the problem that I mentioned earlier in our discussions, namely the fact that we are an extremely segregated community. The blacks in the community, by and large, live north and west of here. And there's a sense in which if you encounter blacks outside of that area, it is because they've been economically successful and have integrated into the community elseways. that was a focus of problem then, it is now. So Father Grappi was very much moved by this, and his was, I think, by and large, a housing-motivated movement. All right, so Judge Cannon was our neighbor, a decent guy, by the way, quality jurist, and a well-motivated individual. His sons have done extremely well in this community. Tom Cannon is a lawyer of many years, and his brother, who's a partner of Pat Dunphy, in Cannon and Dunphy, extremely successful, quality people, properly motivated. And Bob was too. Bob, however, who was, by the way, for a short time Commissioner of Baseball, was a member of the Eagles Club. Now, the Eagles Club was something you don't see in modern times, I guess, like the Elks Club or any. It was a social club, by and large, maybe lower middle class up to upper middle class. Important politically, however, because remember, we elect judges in Wisconsin, and it was important for judges to stay close to the community, and he was a member of the Eagles Club. The Eagles Club was the target of complaints by Father Grappi and the civil rights community, if my recollection is right, because of their membership policies. Now, here I'm a little vague on the details of that, since I personally was not a member of the Eagles Club, was not likely to join the Eagles Club, and it was not of great interest to me. But in any case, he was. And so they felt it was inappropriate for him to, as a judge, to be a member of that club, because the club was not acting favorably towards the black community. So they marched out on several nights to 78th and Wisconsin Avenue, where he lived. It was a large march. And I think historically, if you go to the newspapers, you'll see that march, and Father Grappi led a march across the 6th Avenue Bridge, as I recall it, down into what was the south side as you cross the Menominee Valley. There, again, on the same essentially housing-motivated drive. But in any event, big coverage, major coverage by all the news magazines and the like. And I remember one night being there when the Ku Klux Klan guys showed up. And they were special. They were silk robes, honest to God, real silk robes. And they were interviewed by the media, and I hung around for that interview because, hey, it was a moment. You had to see it, and it's fair to say that these guys were not. They were the Grand Wizard and all that stuff, and they had the peaked hats, and the guy that was the talking head for these guys had a swell silk green robe with little things on it and stuff. It's fair to say that he was not terribly articulate, but he was angry, and I'm sorry, it was very hard to take him seriously. It just was. So he's holding forth in front of a microphone on Bob Callan's sidewalk in front of Bob Callen's house, which was right next to our house. And Father Grappi's guys are on Wisconsin Avenue, and they're all sorts of police. And they're chanting, and I, for the life of me, don't recall what they're chanting. The impression I was left with respect to the whole thing was when I read the accounts of it in Time magazine or Newsweek or one of those. And recall, I was fairly familiar with these magazines because I'd been reading them for many years because of debate and forensics. The most interesting thing I found is how it didn't quite capture the reality that I had actually observed. Not in ways that would suggest they were prejudiced about anything. It's just that it wasn't what I saw, okay? Nothing inaccurate about it, but it had a different texture than what I observed. It was a peculiarly Milwaukee moment in the sense that putting aside the riot period, and there was a period of riots where things were pretty damn serious. Nonetheless, and that was ugly and painful and difficult and had risk associated with it. The people who protested with Grappi were extremely well disciplined in personal terms and conducted themselves within the boundaries that they had set for appropriate behavior. And it wasn't so bad. Everybody was up in arms, yada yada yada, on both sides of the political spectrum. But the abiding memory that I've got is that it was impossible to take the Ku Klux Klan guys seriously. They were ridiculous. That it was definitely possible to take Father Grappi and his people seriously. They were not ridiculous. And that all of it was not conducted badly. Nonetheless, if the reality was here, what people had to say about the reality was somewhere up there. And sometimes, connecting the two wasn't actually happening very well. I fear that we haven't been as successful integrating the community as we could have been. We've tried a bunch of different things. We've tried busing, and we've tried 220 programs. And I'd have to go back through those programs and the mechanics of them to be able to pass along an intelligent judgment to you. But the one thing you can say is they haven't been successful in integrating the community. That doesn't mean that a lot of the members of that community haven't been successfully integrated into every aspect of our daily lives. But it does mean that all of them haven't. And to some extent, there are a lot of problems that remain unsolved to this day. For me, I think some of the best thinking done on those period of time, that period of time, and really continuing into our period of time, was done by Senator Daniel Moynihan of New York, who was a Democratic senator, but whose thoughtful analysis of the problems of that time extends as quality thinking into this time. And there's a lot left to do. And good people are trying to do things. But we're not being as successful as we could be. And that, I don't have a lot more to say about that, except I had never seen a green silk robe from head to toe with a swell hat and a little thing that it was something, as I say, I'd never seen before.
So you mentioned that this was a fairly big story as it should be nationally.
Yes.
And so just kind of describe some of the reactions as Milwaukee, who is now kind of at a focal point of national news, Tosa, who is now as a neighborhood of being a part of this, and now even your block was now a feature of this kind of national movement.
Well, it went away. It kind of stopped. Like so many social movements, it kind of ran out of gas and didn't have the effect it was supposed to have, and then receded, as it were, like the tides. There's a historian named Barbara Tuchman who is worth reading, by the way, if you get a chance. She's written a number of high-quality pieces, but she notes that the things that make the news are almost by definition necessarily extraordinary events, anomalous occurrences, okay, that don't represent what went on for the most part. Father Grappi's movement complained to the community about an important social issue: failure to integrate the black members of Milwaukee into the community on a housing basis, but more broadly on a cultural basis. But the protest and the movements and the hubbub and the hurrahs were what gets remembered. And things were, after all that went away, things were pretty much as they were before. Now, that isn't completely true, because over time, a lot of things have changed. The black community has progressed broadly and across the country in really important respects. But Tuchman's basic proposition that if it's news, if it makes record, if it's extraordinary, it is extraordinary, and to get a clear picture of life as it's going on elsewhere, you can't look to those events and say that's how things were like in the 60s, because they are truly extraordinary events. That isn't how life was in the 60s. That occurred over here. That may not be a completely fair summary, and it in many respects is poorly put, but you see the point.
Yeah. So being that some of these protests were violent, and there were some riots in this city, being that you lived a couple doors down from a location that was being kind of targeted as part of this protest, did your family, did your parents have any kind of concerns or any type of...
No, because it wasn't quite as you describe it, in the sense that, as I said earlier, Father Grappi's protests in front of Judge Cannon's home were disciplined, appropriate, police guarded, and the riots and the problems and the violence had little or nothing to do with Father Grappi and the work that he did, and arose from other contacts between, and here, boy, I can't remember what started, but it may have been an encounter in the near north side between some members of the black community and the police. I don't recall. I don't know. But the point is, those riots were confined to that area and bled across to some extent to a little bit of downtown. Were not driven by Father Grappi and his movement, at least as far as I could see and in my mind. And if you could say, well, yes, they were the product of the general hubbub of the time, I would say a little too neat. And if they were designed to change things, I can tell you they were singularly unsuccessful. More change has come, I think, from change in attitudes. I don't remember, for example, a single black student in my class of 60. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think there were any. Whereas you guys will have a fair number of black kids from the community in your graduating classes. It's also true of Hispanic kids. I think perhaps we've done a little bit better with integrating the Hispanic community than the black community. But so it's important, I think, to distinguish the riots and all that stuff from Father Grappi and that movement. They were by and large unrelated, and so far as I'm concerned, geographically unrelated. Now, I was in my 20s, and when you're in your 20s, you don't really fear physical violence in the same way that you do when you're in your 60s and 70s. Your perceptions of things are different, and there could be some of that in my answers. But that's what I recall.
All right. Is there any further comment you'd like to say on anything civil rights related?
No, I wouldn't think so. Milwaukee's experience is different than I think other experiences throughout the country. Contrast, for example, Atlanta, where I think there's a lot more integration than there is here. And there's I think there's serious people making serious effort to deal with that problem, but I think it's going to take a long time.
All right, so shifting to a slightly happier topic, per se. Did you remember at all the Braves World Series win in '57?
Yes, did.
What was the reaction, or your personal reaction and the city's reaction?
Oh, went nuts. That was a very good baseball team. And it had quality pitching. It had Spahn and Burdette and Bob Buell and decent relievers, although in those times, starters went 9. It was just a tremendous amount of fun. I think they should have won more than they did. I think they should have won in '58 also. They got a 3-1 lead and lost to the Yankees in '58, as I recall it. But they were a wonderful doggone baseball team. They could play. And that was at the beginning of Henry Aaron's era. And Henry Aaron was with the Braves for many, many years, and came to the Brewers in the end. Henry Aaron, for my money, is still the best player I ever saw play baseball. You can say what you want, but you look at his records, and he had more home runs than anybody else who wasn't inflated by drug use. And his hitting of home runs was not what made him so special. The fact he was a doubles hitter, and you couldn't get him or keep him off the bases in any game. He was a 310 or 315 lifetime hitter. That means through thousands and thousands and thousands of at-bats, he was over 300 hitter. He hit for power. He could field. He was just something. And when he was in Atlanta, I followed, and I was at NYU, I followed every day in the newspaper his moving towards 755. Those days in baseball were very, very good, and it was a sadness to lose Braves to Atlanta. And I think a great deal of credit goes to Bud Selig in bringing Brewers from Seattle to here. That was a wonderful achievement. Bud Selig is a hell of a guy. He's done wonderful things for this town, and has done very well for baseball.
So what, you mentioned the move to Atlanta, or the Braves move to Atlanta. What was the city's kind of reaction to that?
They sued him. And they had all sorts of happy theories, and I was interning at the firm that handled the suit on the part of the city, for the city. It was Foley and Larner, and I'm not going to talk about anything accordingly that was talked about there, but they sued him and lost. And they should have lost. It wasn't, there's no real basis for it. This is life is voluntary, and the baseball team's owners wanted to move. They weren't making what they thought was enough money. Now, part of it was their own mistakes. The Brewers have done pretty decently, but sports teams are funny things. You don't make money operating them. You make money when you sell them. You do that because the next guys buying them are prepared to put a great deal of money into them, largely for reasons having to do with the personal ego of the people who are buying them, and the process repeats itself. For the most part, I think very few professional sports franchises actually make money in operations. The money is made, if there is money to be made, on the occasion of sale. When the Braves moved from Milwaukee, however, that was existing ownership picking up the Braves and moving them to Atlanta and continuing to be the same ownership. That was true also for the Dodgers moving from Brooklyn to Los Angeles. Same family owned them before and after, and it was a voluntary economic transaction. The difficulty is baseball's kind of a monopoly. That is to say, you can't run a baseball league unless you control all the teams and you have a league and rules and schedules and relationships. Professional sports leagues' relationships with antitrust law are necessarily a little awkward, and that was true in our setting too.
So you mentioned that the city went nuts, just to kind of wrap up.
That was fantastic.
And even today, there's a good playoff game in the city gets excited for it. So
Yeah.
describe a little bit like what the celebration was like. What was the
Parades and guys on cars going through the city and people throwing confetti and stuff like that. It was pretty special. When I was a kid, Jack Dittmer, who none of you guys would remember, but who was second baseman for the Braves in the early 50s, lived a block away from my parents' home at 6425 West Wells. He lived roughly on 63rd and Wells. But that was a very different time. Lived in a small bungalow, he and his wife, and they were making the money that you could make playing baseball in the late 50s, and that wasn't much. But they were in the community, and they were very much loved. I mean, when they came from Boston, that was a big moment. Milwaukee had always been a good baseball town. The Brewers were a AAA team, and they played at Borchard Field up here. John Gerda would be able to tell you far more about that than I can, because by the time I reached meaningful awareness, the Braves had moved into Milwaukee. I think they moved in '52 maybe, and that would make me 10. So the Brewers AAA team was not a significant part of my gestalt. I wasn't there, but the town had been a serious baseball town, and did well as that, and that's why this team is called Brewers.
Yes, is there anything you'd like to say about the Brewers or anything in general?
Oh, I think the people who run the Brewers have done a great job. I think they were terrific last year, a little unlucky at the end. One kneecap away from being even more successful. Now we've got a quality basketball team and a quality facility. I think we'll see finals this year maybe. Hey, it'll be fun. It's a joy. It's a joy. Good things about this town.
All righty. I think that is all the questions we have for you.
Good. It's been fun, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.